Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today in an introduction to supporting students with autism in higher education. I'm Cecilia and I'm the coordinator of GFD, Global Faculty Development here at the University of Tokyo. So I want to quickly go through how to use the interpretation function. So in the menu, you will find mute, stop video, participants, and one of them will have a circle and it will give you the choice to choose English or Japanese. So choose the channel that you want to hear, and you can switch throughout the talk as well if you want to change. We will record. Please notice that we will record this session, but the faces will not be shown, and the Q&A also will not be shown. So please feel free to ask any questions. So Global Faculty Development is an initiative that is looking to promote an effective education that nurtures global citizens by facilitating exchange of ideas and approaches to teaching and learning practices. We focus on faculty development when teaching courses in other languages than Japanese at the University of Tokyo. We have several workshops happening this month and next month. And right now, this event is part of the creativity series. And next month, we're having the series about transitions from online to offline teaching. So please join us next month as well. And we also have funding for attending faculty development conferences, for organizing events such like this one. So please check our website and join us in 2 weeks, November 10th, for a session on mind mapping for information management and collaborative activities. You will find all the information on our website. And now I'm going to leave you with Elisa, who is the person behind these events. So thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you, Cecilia. Just to introduce myself very quickly, my name is Elisa Ruiz-Tada. I'm a faculty member here at Todai. I'm teaching at the ALES program and FLOW program. And I just wanted to give a short reason of why we were asking GFD for some funding for this workshop. In the ALES, ALESA, and FLOW program, it's a mandatory writing and speaking course for first-year students at the University of Tokyo. And every year we have one or maybe two students who are diagnosed as being on the autistic spectrum disorder. And every year we try our best to support these students, but obviously we needed to learn a bit more about special techniques, pedagogies from an expert. And so we contacted the experts at BGU over a year ago. And we're so excited to have Alison and Julia here today to talk to us about autism and special needs in the classroom. And so first I'd like to introduce Alison and Julia. First, our speaker is Alison Taylor, and she's a teacher and a lecturer on special education needs, disability and inclusion, SENDI, at Bishop Grosseteste University in the UK. And she has over 10 years of primary class teaching experience, as well as being on advisory boards for autism teams of special advisory services. And she has over 5 years of experiences as a special education needs coordinator. And as you know, today's talk is about autism. So her specialty is within the special needs kind of umbrella of different kinds of special needs. Her specialty is on autism, and she's even contributed to the Lincolnshire Autism Partnership Board since 2015. So we're very happy to have Alison talk to us about supporting our students with autism. Today we also have Dr. Julia Lindley Baker, who is the coordinator, and she's teaching undergrads. Oh, hello, sorry. She's teaching undergrads in the SENDI program as well. She originally trained as a special needs teacher with a focus on primary ages, but she has taught and has held many senior positions in an array of settings and leadership positions, always with a special education needs focus. Today she will not be talking, but I think she will be behind the scenes answering any questions that you may have that appear on Zoom or the Zoom chat. We're going to allow Alison to sort of go through her presentation without being interrupted by questions, and hopefully at the end, Julia and Alison can coordinate to answer some of the questions. So I think with that, I'm going to give the floor to Alison. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you so much to Alison and Julia for coordinating with us over the UK time difference as well.
No problems. Looking forward to it. Thank you. Hello, everybody.
Thank you, Lisa. I should just share my screen and hopefully you'll all be able to see my presentation. If somebody could indicate that that's okay.
Yeah,
lovely.
Good. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, hello, I'm really so happy to have the opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you for suggesting this session. So I'm Alison Taylor and I've been studying and working in the field of autism since 1997. And I've had the privilege of working among lots of wonderful young people, colleagues and tutors. But over the years, I've been fascinated by the changes in our understanding of autism and our approaches to support. But above all, I think I've been interested in the shift in our thinking about how we think about autistic difference. Now, the way we speak about difference and the language we use is hugely important. And we want to avoid creating these unnecessary stigmas. But we also want to acknowledge and respond positively to the difference. So for this reason, and to reflect the different personal preferences within the autistic community, I'm going to use the language autistic student and student with autism interchangeably, because some of our young people prefer one reference and others prefer the other. So we're going to be thinking about beneficial autism practice today. We're going to be looking at an approach to working with our autistic learners. But what's really important is to acknowledge that actually many of our autistic students have original, creative and systematic thinking and commitment to their subjects, which either matches or surpasses that of non-autistic students. However, many students with autism don't thrive in higher education. So for a student with ASD, indeed any student, the university experience is a combination of entwined threads and factors, and these can be either positive experiences or negative experiences, and they can be social or they can be academic, or both. And one often affects the other. So support for learners with autism is most beneficial when these individual factors and threads are teased out and we separately understand them. Then the positive experiences and strengths can be capitalized upon, and the negative experiences explored with the student and useful support designed. So understanding that autistic individuals all have their own different perspective of their autism. And only when we collaborate do we see improved participation and achievement. So how do we achieve this? This is the question. Firstly, we need an understanding and awareness of ASD and the reasons that underpin the strengths and challenges of being an autistic student. Secondly, we need knowledge of how to understand the student's individual university experience. And finally, we need to be able to collaborate with the student to suggest and implement those adaptations which will be of benefit to them. Okay. So our learning outcomes then for today, my aims for today's session are to understand the nature of strengths and difficulties experienced by autistic learners, to appreciate the underlying reasons for the differences associated with autism, to gain confidence in collaboration and communication with our young people with autism, and to increase our knowledge of approaches and strategies which support autistic learners. And by the end of the session, I hope you'll feel more able to take the next steps in improving understanding and supports for students with autism. So here's an important point for us to start with. I want us to think about uncertainty and not knowing what to expect, because this can quickly lead to feelings of anxiety, especially if we are finding ourselves in new and very different situations to that which we are familiar and comfortable with. So going to university, changing where and how we live is something that is really challenging for our young people with autism. They are meeting new people and learning in a new environment, and this can create high anxiety, particularly if they do not possess effective coping mechanisms. So coping mechanisms is the important bit there. Let's consider then an analogy of using an airport for the first time, which can be confusing and stressful. However, once the separate aspects of air travel are understood and experienced regularly, it becomes easier and more familiar each time. Helpful strategies include knowing what to expect in advance, and we can support our students with autism if they know what to expect in advance, what order the different aspects happen in, and having clear signage and direction during the experience, you see. It also helps if the staff are friendly and kind at the airport. Now, for me personally, I find the departure board part the most stressful part. Not knowing which departure gate will be needed, nor how far away the gate is, or how long it will take to get there. Wondering if there will be enough time to reach it once the gate number is finally displayed. So at this point in the experience, when my anxiety is high, I rely on others to provide reassurance and strategies to unwind. So although this is an analogy, I wanted to start it by giving you an overview so you know what to expect, so it is familiar and it is certain. So it's approximately a 2-hour session. You can post questions in the chat. The first half will be about difference and inclusion, understanding autism and general support, and how we think about an autism-friendly campus. There'll then be a short comfort break at around slide 11, if any of you are counting, and some questions. In the second half, we'll look at how to take an individual approach, and we'll finish with a summary, reference, further questions, and contact details. So I hope that gives you a clear indication of what to expect, and that will reduce any anxiety anyone might be feeling. So that's an example. So why is this important then? Inclusion and diversity link really strongly with our human rights. And of course, Japan ratified the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Person with Disabilities in January 2014. Now, this convention confirms that people with disabilities are full and equal members of society with the same human rights. Although the ideology of inclusion is difficult to achieve with our current systems and structures, we must still continue to strive towards it. Now, we know that inclusion and diversity is on the agenda for many higher education institutions, with well-being, participation and achievement as our important aims. Most universities have dedicated departments such as student services, who can signpost and guide students with special educational needs through their university experience. But whilst student services are important, inclusion is most effective when it permeates the university, when all staff members, all students have a common understanding of inclusion and why it's important. With the right planning and support, more autistic students can excel at university. So UK research by Guldberg et al. From 2019 shows 2.4% of the student population in 2008 were on the autism spectrum. And these numbers are expected to have increased. So there are more and more students with autism joining higher education. Yet there is evidence that less than 40% of autistic students successfully complete their studies. In the UK, the prevalence of autism generally has been stable at 1 in 99 people for some time. However, some new statistics, which were published in March in 21 by Newcastle and Cambridge University, demonstrate an increase in prevalence among children of school age to 1 in 57. Now, this means that these children, whose numbers are increasing, are going to be ready for university in the future. And it's important that we are ready to support them. In Japan, the autism prevalence is reported at around 1 in 55. Okay, so very similar. We need to be ready to support these children as they reach university. They have a lot to contribute. So an individualised approach, which will form the second half. Jordan and Powell from 1995 said there is no one set recipe approach in supporting students with autism. It's a highly variable condition. It's a spectrum condition, and so an individual approach is needed, and one which takes into consideration the student's own unique profile of strengths and challenges. Now, this can only be achieved by working in collaboration with the student to understand what will help them personally. As Pollard, 1997, states, to understand thoroughly is a precondition of acting effectively. We need to collaborate. So if we are able to understand the perceptions and experiences of our students with autism and make adjustments to our teaching to support this, then the benefits are far-reaching. Student well-being improves and academic attainment increases. Peers relate more easily with the student with autistic difference, reflecting the understanding and positive regard demonstrated by the lecturer. Lecturers feel more confident in their interactions, and the parents of autistic students worry less. And future students coming to the university will benefit from the growth of awareness and the inclusivity of the university. So how do we think about difference generally then? How has our thinking unfolded over the years? The way we currently think about disability is often illustrated through 3 theoretical models. Firstly, we'll think about the medical model, including the use of diagnostic criteria. So this model focuses on within-person factors. Disability has been rooted in the medical model for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and is concerned with the approaches which locate the problem within the person. This model is concerned with deficits and diagnosis, with labels, with treatment, with intervention, and will often evoke emotions of pity while segregating or stigmatizing the individual. In more recent history, there has been a determined shift in thinking away from this model. However, the reality is that many of our support systems and policies are still based on aspects of this model. Many supports require a diagnosis in order to access support. The social model of disability concerns issues with the attitudes of others and the environment. So the social model emerged in the UK in the late 1970s and called for better rights and respect for disabled people. The theory separates the impairment experienced by the person from the disability. It suggests that with appropriate changes to environments and attitudes within society, the impairment is no longer a source of disability. And thus it claims it is a lack of understanding, it is poor attitudes and poorly adjusted environments which are the cause of the disability, a social construct, not the person's impairment. The third theoretical model of disability is the affirmative model, and this demonstrates pride in difference. And in this model of thinking, disability is seen as part of the person's identity rather than something separate. For example, this is often the case for people with autism who have a high IQ and become more adept in managing the challenges of daily life. They are able to participate and achieve to an extent that they are comfortable, accepting and proud of their difference as part of who they are. So despite these ideological models being so distinct, it is necessary to move fluidly between the three, enabling us to be respectful and genuine, whilst also being able to access the systems of support which for now remain partly rooted in the medical model and reliant on a diagnosis. So difference is part of each unique individual experience of strengths and weaknesses. It can be referred to as a profile, which demonstrates individual preferences for living life, such as ways of achieving independence, learning, socializing, and relaxing. The uniqueness of these profiles is key to providing meaningful support. So whilst today we'll be focusing on supporting autistic students, when we think about difference, it is important to also consider any co-occurring conditions or diagnoses, which may also impact on the way the student experiences university life. We want this university experience to be positive, to be happy, to be fulfilling. And the only way to achieve this is to ensure the student feels able to communicate their needs to us through a channel of communication which is comfortable and effective for them. So although we might be aware that a student has autism, we need to be responsive to personality and preferences and aim to form a genuine relationship, whether that be in person or electronically via Teams or email, so we can have the fullest possible insight into what would support that individual student. So then, autism, what do we see? Autistic students will be faced with many of the same challenges as non-autistic students when they first come to university. The important thing to remember is their ability to problem solve, adjust and cope in these new situations will be significantly affected by the autism unless useful strategies and support is available. So what makes this a distinct group then? What is beyond this diagnostic criteria? If we understand the nature of autism, we can be more effective in our support. The reason for including the spyglass as an illustration is to demonstrate the need to view situations from the perspective of the student with autism through the autism lens. The reason for including the normal curve is to demonstrate that autistic responses to situations are often in excess or less than may be expected. So, for example, a student might have an intense eye gaze, or they may prefer to avoid eye gaze. They might dominate conversation, or they may avoid conversation. What's important to remember is that although there are aspects of everyday life for our young people with autism, which they don't easily understand intuitively, they can learn cognitively ways of gaining insight into non-autistic communication and interaction and behaviours. So let's first think about communication differences. The strengths and challenges experienced in these areas will vary between individuals. So it's vitally important that we know what these differences mean for the student. For some, they will be articulate and might dominate conversational seminars, but find following and understanding the incidental speech is challenging. For other autistic students, they may experience disfluency when speaking, preferring to type, but they have good rote memory and comprehension for spoken information. It is important not to assume that expressive language skills and receptive language skills are of the same level, and to understand that it can vary in different situations. Understanding is often literal until the complexities of language and meaning are more familiar. Some jokes and metaphors can cause confusion unless accompanied by an explanation. And autistic students can achieve highly in their language abilities, but this is often in the realms of familiarity and can result in significant fatigue. Social interaction differences follow a similar pattern. The social codes that many of us conduct our lives by are often implicit and learnt by absorbing them from our own experiences. For students on the autism spectrum, a natural social ability and ease is difficult to achieve at times and often relies on self-taught strategies, such as watching peers and adjusting their own responses and mannerisms to match. They might find it difficult to hear the natural pauses in conversation and speak over people, or prefer to change the topic to something they are more familiar with. It can be a challenge at times to read those subtle meanings conveyed in facial expressions, the tone of voice or the body language. And this can mean that conversations and actions are less inhibited than for many non-autistic students because they're not getting the feedback. This challenge in reading social situations can result in feelings of isolation and loneliness or frustration. So let's use another analogy. We can relate to this if we imagine ourselves attending a party alone, where all other guests have known each other for many years. How would we respond in that situation? By trying to integrate in an unfamiliar social situation, we would require more conscious thought and feel different emotions. If we did not understand nor agree with the partygoers' opinions, we might react more strongly, uninhibited, because we wouldn't feel any connection to them. Either way, by the end of the evening, we would feel very drained and reluctant to experience this kind of social discomfort again. We would avoid future situations. For this reason, preferred repetitive and routine behaviours are often developed in an attempt to maintain familiarity, certainty, and comfort to avoid otherwise unpredictable situations from occurring. So autistic students have reported differences also in their sense of direction, finding the layout of the campus very challenging to store in their memory. Even after 2 or 3 years, this can still be the case. For other autistic students, visual mapping is a strength, and they do not experience this difficulty. Preference for sameness is a coping mechanism for those who get lost, and those last-minute changes to seminar rooms can be extremely distressing for many autistic students. For some, they may have a preference for a particular seat or a position in the room. If they do not have to feel anxiety on entering the room, nor be worried about the availability of that seat, then they have more cognitive energy for the learning. If the familiar seat is not available for some autistic students, their thoughts will be completely taken up perseverating on the situation, and little learning will occur. So they can have a strong focus and passion for their subject, and for many, their interest and aptitude in a subject can be intense. The pedagogy that is most effective for them may be different from that of other students, but understanding their learning preferences can be achieved through conversation and collaboration. Students with autism will often strive for perfection, sometimes to a point where they put unhealthy pressure on themselves. Some students have immense capacity for rote learning and cataloguing of information, but benefit from support to make the links between learning, to generalise and to apply learning in different contexts. Other students with autism will be able to process and mentally view complex information simultaneously. These autistic students will have what we call systemising as their form of thinking. Sensory differences. The 7 senses affected by autism are sight, smell, touch, sound, taste, vestibular sense or balance, and proprioception, which is our internal sensation and sense of place within surrounding space. You might see students with autism finding ways of avoiding situations which involve uncomfortable sensory experiences. And when these situations are unavoidable, you might see an increase in anxiety and a decrease in focus, communication, and learning. Some students will react with very obvious behaviour changes when experiencing sensory discomfort. Others will try and mask it and withdraw or even shut down completely, no longer able to function. Some autistic students will have developed methods for making their intense and intolerable sensory experiences more manageable, but this method of coping leaves them exhausted and is still a barrier to learning. To complicate matters, an autistic student's responses to sensory stimuli can fluctuate and appear inconsistent. So again, each autistic student will have their own unique profile of sensory sensitivities that can be chatted about or emailed to a lecturer or key trusted person, so adjustments can be made. And of course, if we take into consideration all this, then associated anxiety and vulnerability to mental health challenges is something we need to consider. So although it's not considered a mental health issue, the nature of difference in communication, perception, and processing creates many situations throughout each day where reasonable adjustments to the environment, the pedagogy, and to relationships means feelings of anxiety can escalate. If a state of anxiety becomes the normal, long-term emotional state of the student, then there are very real and serious dangers of this leading to depression, self-harm, or even suicide. Okay. So why do we see it? What's underlying? To be frank, we all experience life differently, but what is it about this spectrum condition that makes autism impact both positively and negatively the individual the way it does? Well, firstly, it's a form of neurodiversity, that is differences in brain function which affect the way someone might socialise, attend to and process stimuli, how they store and retrieve information, how they feel and respond. Neurodiversity refers to variation of brain function within the population. The way in which this thinking affects the way in which an autistic person interacts with the environment or with others results obviously in feelings and behaviours or actions. Therefore, the behaviours we observe are underpinned by these differences in thinking, particularly perception and processing. So whilst the observable behaviours can be likened to the iceberg, what is beneath the surface of the water? So early development of autistic thinking is based very much on cause and effect and literal understanding. There is a tendency for play to be sensory motor driven rather than social play or symbolic play with complex narratives. Early language development may be delayed, atypical or directive, with many sort of surface features and surface structures being prominent. However, despite these early barriers, autistic thinking and language can develop to be highly unique and innovative in some areas, though less effective in some areas of everyday functioning. So this can impact on executive functioning, that is the ability to plan, organise, inhibition and concept of time. So executive function refers to the ability to plan, the ability to organise, to inhibit our actions and to regulate our emotions and responses, and to relate to the concept of time. These executive functions are performed in the frontal lobe of the brain, and anomalies in the number of neurons in the autistic brain, in particular the prefrontal cortex, in comparison to controls, are suggested as the root cause of difficulties in this area of functioning. So regardless of academic knowledge in an area of expertise, a person with autism may have considerable difficulty organising their morning routine to leave the house on time without the help of useful strategies. So differences in thinking can also be seen as having an impact on central coherence. That's the ability to generalise, to make links, and is linked to memory. It is thought that having weaker central coherence can make it difficult for autistic people to get the gist or general meaning of situations or information. They instead are likely to focus on the separate details without bringing them together to form a cohesive whole. This can create challenges for memory, as whole meanings are assumed easier to store and retrieve. Rote memory is often relied upon instead, so remembering things in a list. Students with autism might display good rote memory due to it being their preferred style. However, this can be limited in its capacity without the student generalising or making links. And so full understanding may not always be achieved. And we need to be aware of this. So it can also be an impact on theory of mind. That's the perception of others' thoughts, their perspectives, and intentions. So Baron Cohen and Frith proposed that people with autism do not have a strong theory of mind. That is, they find it difficult to predict or perceive the thoughts and intentions of others' actions. It was felt that this difficulty, understanding others, contributed to a high anxiety and also to difficulty adjusting their responses in conversations in relation to that sort of subtle feedback from those that they were interacting with. So, for example, not being aware that the other person needs to be at another appointment and so wants to end the conversation. They might continue to talk unaware of the other person's need to leave. Inflexible thinking like this is linked to autism and can be seen in preference for familiarity and anxiety around transitions, but it will manifest in varying degrees in individuals. However, it can be argued that non-autistic people can also demonstrate weak theory of mind when they are unable to predict the thoughts and intentions of autistic people. So sensory perceptions can be tuned differently and fluctuate depending on multiple factors. Sensory differences can affect any or many of the 7 senses. Referring back to the normal curve, sensory stimuli from the environment or from other people may be experienced very intensely or hypersensitively, as it's known. Or for those responses at the other end of the normal curve, they can be experienced in a very muted way or hyposensitively. And this creates uncomfortable and often intolerable sensory experiences for students with autism, because they may struggle to filter or regulate their perception of noise, smell, light, colour or movement, touch, proximity, balance or internal sensations. It is important to be aware that sensory experiences can fluctuate depending on the student's level of anxiety and tolerance at that given moment, or on factors such as hunger, lack of sleep, or the amount of control they have to handle the situation. So these differences in thinking can lead to uncertainty and a preference for sameness in an attempt to avoid situations for which they feel unprepared to cope with. And these underlying differences are the submerged portion of the autism iceberg. They are the part that is more difficult to see, but so important to understand. If we don't, this can lead to the student developing strong negative associations and anxiety, potentially leading to mental health difficulties, including withdrawn behaviour, stress, and depression. I find it helpful to think of a bucket as an analogy for stress, and there's a picture there in the bottom right-hand corner. Every challenging situation that causes anxiety pours more and more stress into that bucket. Eventually, the bucket won't be able to hold any more and the water will come flooding over the top. However, with adjustments to our attitudes, the environment, and by suggesting support and strategy, we create little holes in the bucket, which allows the stress levels to remain low while it seeps away more slowly. What we need is a balance of enough support to prevent the rise of stress from everyday experiences. So how can we support our autistic students to have that positive university experience? So support can be formal or it can be informal. It can be scheduled for a particular time and place, or it can be incidental as situations arise. So firstly, form a genuine relationship and be available, whether this is a key person of contact or whether it's a lecture at the beginning or the end of a session. So although a key person is very helpful to reassure, to support and inform our autistic students, it is also important for regular lecturers and tutors to reassure the student that they're very much a welcome member of the group. As for any student on the course, learn their name and their interests where possible and value their contributions. Some students with autism sometimes find that spotlight attention in front of a group difficult to cope with, so pick moments carefully. So find the best way to communicate socially and intellectually for the individual. Some autistic students may be able to access the student support services that are generally available for students. However, many might find this step too daunting or may require support to realise there is help available. Some students might like to bring a trusted friend to an appointment with a tutor and find it easier to articulate their feelings and experiences. Some might prefer to talk before or after a lecture if time allows, or to know they can send an email or voice recording as communication if they wish to. So we need to consider how to make our language more accessible. Generally, we can make simple changes to our language to make processing easier for the student. We can slow the pace of our speech, we can leave pauses for processing and explicitly alert students to the key information. We can give spoken instructions in the order that they should be performed and use gesture to alert students to shifts in attention or focus. We can avoid ambiguous language and metaphor, or just to reduce the risk of literal misinterpretation. Or if we don't want to take that out of our lectures, we can simply announce only joking, not literally. It's important to make implicit learning explicit. So we use clear explanation to emphasize any implicit learning, echoing useful contributions from other students in case the autistic student missed the shift in attention from listening to the lecturer to attending to someone else speaking from somewhere else in the room. Knowledge of study skills and group working skills can also be explicitly explained rather than assumed. So you don't want to leave the autistic student to try and work it out, whilst also cognitively managing a social situation. Let's make auditory information visual. The spoken word is very fleeting and invisible. And for those students who find auditory processing difficult, this can be a poor means of learning. Remember, even very articulate autistic students might find receptive language abilities aren't as strong. So these students benefit from having the learning visually supported, either by words on a slide or additional notes, pictures, diagrams, or video clips. Try and reduce sensory stimulation to support focus. Be aware of the sensory environment of the lecture halls and seminar rooms. Whilst non-autistic students are able to tolerate the buzz of a projector, the heat from a radiator, or the glare on the screen, the movement of others outside a window, our autistic students will feel this more intensely, unable to concentrate due to the distraction or discomfort of the sensory environment. So although it is not always possible to change these stimuli instantly, a sensory audit can illuminate aspects of the learning spaces which can be adjusted. Empowering the autistic student by asking them how they find the environment or allowing them to leave the situation temporarily to self-regulate in a quiet space can help avoid sensory overload or shutdown. It's also important to be clear in timings. For some autistic students, rigidity and fixation with time can become problematic in encountering the day. Differences in executive functioning means they can sometimes feel stuck in time and benefit from knowing the structure and timings of the day. It is important to state these are approximate timings if they are likely to change. Students can often be reassured by giving logical reasons for any changes to timings. So although these adjustments might appear minimal, it is these shifts in approach which, when combined, help to reduce the anxiety experienced, thus leaving more cognitive energy for learning. How are we doing for time? Not too bad. So, autism, how can we support? What strategies can be applied? We know that visual structures are really helpful, such as frameworks, flowcharts, mind maps, and checklists can all be used to support planning and organisation, or for the autistic student to communicate their understanding and ideas in seminars, or for the lecturer to concisely illustrate information. Visual schedules can reduce anxiety, like an overview, by making events more predictable, such as an overview of a session, a project to-do list, clearly written steps of instructions for a seminar task. Keep it visual. Concrete examples, first-hand experience, examples, modelling and demonstrating are all really useful strategies which can be accessed by the autistic learner. So learning which involves experience and interaction is most likely to be understood, and modelling and demonstrating is particularly effective with autistic students who find the spoken word more difficult to process. By seeing what is expected, they are often more able to produce what is required without misunderstanding the task or assignment. So rehearsal, pre-teaching and previews. Familiar content enables a student to feel more confident and is then more likely to store as new learning. Providing a related chapter to read in advance, a brief conversation or slide about what will be covered next week, or a preview of new vocabulary or content the student can research, can give them an opportunity to prepare, making links between sessions. Alternative methods of recording, note-taking, assessment, permanent information. Students might find benefit from recording sessions if a general recording isn't available. This will enable students that find handwritten notes or processing and typing takes them more time than is available to keep up with the pace of the lecture. Traditionally, Assessment for course modules are fixed as a single assignment brief for all students to complete. But with inclusion and equity high on the agenda, some universities are considering the need for alternative assessment briefs, giving students more autonomy on how they demonstrate their understanding of the assignment. Brain breaks, short burst learning. We highlighted previously how students with autism will be using their cognitive energies to process and respond to social situations, executive functions, auditory processing, and sensory perceptions. That's a lot of cognitive energy. For this reason, autistic students will experience higher levels of stress and anxiety, whilst also feeling more fatigued from the effort involved. For this reason, it can be helpful to build in short 5-minute brain breaks or pauses for processing within a long lecture or session. Regular short comfort breaks can reassure an autistic student that there will be a discrete opportunity to leave the room and self-regulate to manage any build-up of stress. And many non-autistic students can benefit from learning in shorter chunks too. So enabling environment then. So by reducing sensory stimuli, allowing seating choice, by keeping environments familiar and predictable where possible, we can improve the quality of learning experience for autistic, if not all, students. Communal areas of the university, such as the accommodation blocks, library and canteen, may require consideration to enable some autistic students to use these facilities comfortably. Strategies such as rehearsal, perhaps a supported visit during a quiet time, can be beneficial. So how do we create an autism-friendly university? At BGU, we are working towards creating a more autism-friendly university. We have created a society for students with autism and their friends and allies known as ARCH, which is the Autism Resource and Community Hub. And that is a one-stop shop for any information or companionship that students with autism might benefit from. They've also got designated quiet spaces around the campus and at events as well. So if events become overwhelming, there are retreats that students can use. So our society, ARCH, has a page embedded as part of the university website, and much work has also been done to improve signage around the campus, wanting it to be at eye level. We have a Research and Innovation Centre, which holds an Autism Ideas Cafe every 2 months, and there is a showcase of research by autistic researchers from the Participatory Autism Research Collective, or PARC. And these activities can be accessed through Eventbrite. So just to return, sorry, interpreters, in 2018, Dublin City University became our first university in the world to achieve autism-friendly university status. And research revealed that although there are pockets of activity in relation to creating autism-friendly environments, there is recognition that students with autism might need and benefit from supports that extend beyond and complement the support services that are typically provided to all students. Okay, so a society for students with autism, their friends and allies. Sensory issues are addressed and reduced. Quiet spaces provided around the campus and at events. Visible information in one place. A reduction of stigma so that they feel able to reveal their diagnosis and access and accept support. Specific autism training for all staff. Better communication across different offices, including administration. And improved signage that is clear, unambiguous, and eye level, and additional support for navigating the library and canteens. Okay, time to pause. I apologise for looking down and reading during my presentation, the first half of my presentation, but I wanted to try and assist the interpreters in their task. I wonder if Julia would like to come in, if there's any questions at this point. We're going to take a short break. You might want to think about sort of some of the autistic students you have taught or you've worked alongside or that you are friends with, and consider some of the barriers they've faced, you know, what were their strengths and what works for them. Those 3 questions can be really helpful in evaluating our practice and supporting the individual. So while we have a short sort of 10-minute break, I'll go to Julia and see if there's any questions that have arisen.
Just an audio feedback. At the moment, there's... Hi, sorry, I've got my headphone up too high. Hi, thanks, Alison. That was very interesting. As it stands and looking at the chart, I can't see any particular questions. So we'll just take a 5 or 10-minute break and then start again. Maybe you want to just refresh yourself as well, get a drink.
Yeah, that'd be lovely. And yeah, so if we continue about 5 past.
Yeah, I've just got one that's coming, so I'll read that through because it's a very long question. So I'll have a look at that from Tom Galley. Thanks, Tom. I'll just pick that one up and then Alison might have a look as well while she has a little break.
Okay, thank you.
First.
I think, firstly, the organisation of a society, in order to provide an identity and some representation of autism, is a good starting point, so that from there a series of events and conversations and staff training can be done in order to help grow that sense of awareness. Yourself, Julia, your thoughts?
Well, again, I think your culture might facilitate some of these, but also may inhibit or stop. what we've done at BGU is we have a student support framework where individual students can go forward and put proposals together for 1 year or 2 year projects which they'd like to have sponsored by the university. And sometimes it comes with a small amount of funding, or occasionally it's just about recognition and an agreement to promote it. So some of these ideas would be to have what we call host an autism bus on the campus. So we bring practitioners in that are situated in a prominent place around the campus, so that other students can be, if you wish, exposed to the type of needs which people with autism might be experiencing. We also have a cafe, which, for want of a better word, is named as an autism cafe, but it's open to everybody, and it's on particular days that students who are really want a bit of specialist support or somebody just to chat to informally about their concerns. It's a drop-in basis, but again, these are part of the profile of the university and supported and also worked through with research. So other colleagues look at research in higher education. Students are encouraged to do that as part of their own information gathering as well. They're just a couple of ideas off the top of my head. We could perhaps share more feedback after the session today, some of those strategies which we have used across the university in a more formal document, if that would help. And then I'm just so thank you for asking as well. It's a good question, that one. I'm scrolling down now, Alison, to many of the student support structures to empower students with disabilities exist outside of the campus settings. To reach the campus, students must find a nearby residence, navigate complex commuting networks, secure access. So each step that everybody needs to do around the building seems to make it more complicated. How do we coordinate all these efforts between the different stakeholders and the responsibilities within the education system? Oh, that's a good question.
Very good.
My own experience would be that as a leader of I used to be a manager, head teacher of a very large specialist university, and it was having the voice at the table, really. So when we were looking at new buildings, we had a piece of legislation as well that supported us, of Disability Discrimination Act and then the Equality Act, which meant that everything that went through the conversations at the board meeting had to be cross-checked against that piece of legislation. And I was usually the pain in everyone's side when I would challenge what was being proposed and ask the questions, and what about? So it's not an easy process, but it is about having the legislation that you can actually present to planners and developers, which helps to slowly shape and recreate information. Other information might be that you set up a sign-in system of particular logos, design a logo that is used on particular buildings or used as a mapping system, so the students can identify with a visual symbol to help them track and locate places where they need to go. So we've used that on previous occasions. Any thoughts, Alison?
Just around the idea of communication, really, in that if there is a point of communication within the campus, which a student can access easily, and have some support to then connect via a Teams meeting, that could perhaps cut out some of the navigational aspects. So just thinking about communication hubs that are accessible and making sure that if you're going to offer support, that it is within the realms of reaching it for students that have these kind of issues and challenges. But yes, I think gradual movements towards change is the best way. Thank you, Julia.
And the next, one of the other questions, which I think is going to be in part 2, it's raised by John, looking at different strategies and ways teaching ideas. I think you're going to go on to that, are you not, Alison?
Yeah, this is going to break it down into 10 areas.
Okay,
which should support the teaching.
So John, if that's okay, we'll go into part 2, and then if you feel that you'd like a little bit more from us, then we'll follow that conversation up after the next part of the presentation. And Alison is bravely also going to be leaving you with her email address. So we're really happy to keep continuing these discussion outside of this particular set time. Great, thanks, John. And I will keep going back to the questions now they're posing. So I'll shut up for now, and Alison, and let you carry on.
Thanks, Julia. Thank you. Okay, so I hope you all feel a little bit refreshed, having a processing pause or a fidget break or an opportunity just to reset before the next half of the presentation, which is going to be very much about the individualized approach. Because as we said at the beginning, autism is a spectrum condition, so there's considerable variability between people with the same diagnosis. There's no one set way of meeting everybody's needs. You need to have an understanding from which you can operate. So remember, autistic students have their own perceptions of their autism that we need to understand. And for this reason, the individualized approach is needed, one which takes into consideration the student's own unique profile and experience of strength and challenges. So this can only be achieved by building a relationship and working in collaboration. So if we look at this graph here, we've got skills and behaviours along the bottom, and we've got a rough scale. Again, it's just an impression of how adept, how efficient, how skillful different areas are. So we can see that in some areas, abilities are quite strong. Perhaps the student is articulate. But in other areas, we can see that there's definite areas where there are challenges. So we must be careful not to locate the deficiencies solely within the student, and remember to evaluate the impact of the environment, the pedagogy, and of other people. So the autistic student has strengths which can be built upon, and these might include honesty, original thought, adherence to academic or subject-specific rules, passion for their specialism, good rote memory, attention to detail, and a need for accuracy. The dips in the profile might be understanding the spoken word, so receptive language, where to direct focus, being able to filter sound from the environment or other sensory issues, or engaging in group work might be something that's a real challenge, or general happiness. Sometimes the most academic of autistic students will experience personal challenges in areas we take for granted. For example, organising their morning routine before leaving the accommodation, preparing food or washing clothes can be very difficult. So we're looking at that individual profile and how we find out what it is. So when deciding on the most appropriate support for students, it is important to work collaboratively. When we think about difference, we're moving away from that medical model of disability. So we do not want to make decisions for the students without involving them as fully as we can. So support is done with the student rather than done to. So how do we do this? In its simplest form, we can ask the student about what works well for them, what causes them difficulties and challenges, and what can be done to overcome these barriers that are identified. And for many of our students, they will have fairly clear ideas of those answers. So if you've got this good relationship and an open and comfortable channel for communication, you will get more honest and insightful and useful insights to work from. Some might not realise they need support, or they might not be able to pinpoint what exactly helps them. So prompts, we can prompt in an informal email, maybe as a first good communication, as a preview to a face-to-face meeting, giving them time to think. So the following slides are from my own sort of research and explore 10 areas for consideration which can guide our thinking, and it forms an underlying structure for our support, collaboration and conversation. So these considerations can be explored with the student over time, not all at once, and in different situations. It is not a checklist. It is not a checklist to interview the student with. It's merely aspects of autism to hold in mind when having different conversations. So firstly, we need to think about the quality of teaching, the tutor role, and relationship. So we learn best when we feel secure, relaxed, and happy. Stress has a direct impact on our processing and memory capability, and a positive relationship will secure a sense of value and provide better conditions for learning. So I'm going to include some examples. So firstly, Kirsten. Kirsten benefited from arriving early to the lecture room and chatting beforehand. Not always about the work, but often about things that she'd done during the week. The lecturer was still able to set up the session, and Kirsten was able to regulate herself in a quiet room by having a chat. It also meant she could select her seat and avoid the busy spell. She would also wait at the end of the lecture to let the main noisy group leave, and then chat about some of her thoughts relating to the lecture, and then leave in the quietness. That was a strategy for Kirsten that helped her to keep her anxiety low and her cognitive energy freed for learning. Sophia benefited from email reassurance when she was first interpreting a new assignment brief. She relied on the email reassurance to ensure she hadn't gone off on a tangent. Topic maintenance is something that's sometimes quite challenging. She needed to send 6 different emails before she started her assignment, but it meant that she didn't carry the anxiety throughout the assignment. The lecturer accepted the many emails sent at the beginning of the assignment, which was then completed independently by the student and to a good standard. So those were 2 strategies that worked for individual students in particular situations. The quality of teaching is essential for all students to learn, and this is reflected in policy documents for school-age learners and is equally important for HE. So the pedagogy matters. The seminar or presentation should be such that it is clear, logical, easy to follow with clear learning points, and that teaching should enable learning. It's important to be guided by the student and offer the least amount of support needed first. This way, we're not over-supporting the student and making them dependent or de-skilled. We don't want to underestimate the capability of our autistic students. When the learning conditions are right for them as individuals, they are able to achieve towards their potential. So here are some of the ideas then. We want to support learning through modelling, demonstrating, explaining and discussing. The more visual, the more gesture, the more examples that we use, the more real and tangible the understanding is. And we need to be careful not to create tasks which continually test what they know, but focus more on the learning process and pedagogy. So use modelling and supported involvement before expecting independence. So that relationship and the quality of teaching is perhaps the first prompt for our thoughts and conversations. Communication, language and processing. How strong is the student's expressive language? Are they able to articulate their thoughts? Or do they express more comfortably by typing? Students who dominate discussions or who are fearful of contributing can type their responses perhaps on a blank note section of the slides and then share it later in person or by email. Be quite explicit in the way you want the students' ideas to be fed back and give plenty of prior warning so that they can prepare their answers or provide an alternative method if they want to jot ideas on a post-it note or to use a Padlet. So here's an example, Natalie. Okay, Natalie feels unable to speak up and contribute to large group seminars, but by providing a link to a Padlet, Natalie can demonstrate her understanding by making anonymous posts. And this serves as a record of Natalie's thoughts, which she can look back on and which she can share with tutors when appropriate. So it's finding a different way, a way that works for Natalie to enable her to contribute to seminars. We also need to consider how strong their receptive language is, their comprehension and understanding of speech. We consider recording sessions or perhaps previewing slides with their accompanying notes, or doing a bit of a pre-teach at the end of the previous session so that it gives a kind of a insight into what's going to be coming. Visual support materials help to support difficulties with receptive language, whether it's a diagram or a table. Chunking information with pauses for processing makes it more manageable and supports memory by giving that pause and allowing for processing. And being able to look back on recorded sessions from maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago can really help a student with autism to find that link that flows between the sessions. So it's really the principles of good quality blended learning, if you like, of having those points of reference to refer back to. So how strongly, when you're having your conversation, is the student connecting with the topic of learning? Do they have a framework of key points or key themes that the learning sits within? Can this be represented visually as a mind map? Make the links between previous and current learning explicit, point them out, rather than assuming that they have made the connection. Try and support those shifts in focus or shifts in topic, and use commentary or thinking out loud to illustrate invisible thought processes of the lecturer. So you can almost give a running commentary, think out loud, to just really be explicit about how your thoughts are unfolding around the key points of learning. Once again, consider that pace and language of instruction. Can it be adjusted to be more accessible? So here's an example. Emily, okay? Emily finds it better to be doing something else while listening because it actually supports her listening. If she only listens, and that's all she's doing on a single channel, it feels too intense for her. It feels too much to process, and she actually benefits from peripheral processing. This means she processes better if she's not attending to it directly, to that source. Although she knows this about herself and knows that this is how she learns best, it generates anxiety because she fears a lecturer might interpret it as not being interested or not being engaged or even being rude. But Emily knows that she learns best with peripheral attention. Some students with autism may benefit from having cues to strengthen their group identity. That is, instructions regarding the group might not be perceived as relevant to them unless it is made explicit and supported with gesture. So sometimes an autistic student won't feel strongly that group identity and may not realise that they are included in that group address. Provide keywords and vocabulary for the session, much as you would an article, and give definitions as a glossary or as they occur in the lecture. So you can either pre-print definitions that are going to be relevant, or you can pause as you go through your delivery, giving small, short definitions of any vocabulary that might be misunderstood. Aim to keep language unambiguous and clear to support a tendency to be literal or pedantic. So be very aware they may take the real literal meaning or the surface structure of the words you are using. And reduce anxiety, support more comfortable and effective communication. So you can see all our strategies kind of need to work together. Social engagement. Have a conversation with your student about social engagement. How comfortable does the student feel within the particular group? We know feelings of isolation are reported as a regular feature of autistic students' university experience. Positive regard and inclusive attitude demonstrated by the lecturer will permeate within the peer group. By being an inclusive role model, staff can demonstrate the value of diversity within our learning communities. So value contributions encourage autistic students to play to their strengths and learn and use their name. So for many students with autism, group working is effortful and draining and often hinders the learning process rather than helping it. Paired work with a familiar and trusted peer or working in a smaller group of 3 might be more manageable than a larger group work. But for some students with autism, they may prefer to work alone. So Emily again, she tells me, from personal experience, the most common way an activity is made inaccessible to me is by making the group aspect compulsory. She says, except some autistic students might prefer to work alone in some situations. It is possible for them to engage and contribute without the pressure of a social situation. Our goal is for them to learn rather than to conform to learning styles which just don't work for them. So that's a personal reflection. However, for some students with autism, the skills of working in a group can be developed. Explain explicitly the purpose, the benefits, the ways of organising and approaching group work. Teach the skills in steps. How can we do this? So learning new skills is most successful when we implement new elements gradually, changing just one thing at a time. We can provide or encourage students to assign clear roles within the group work, so they know exactly what their role is. We can provide or encourage students to make a checklist or brief agenda for discussion, whether this is on a post-it note or more formal. If appropriate, perhaps allow some discussion in Japanese, but suggest the note-taking is in English. Perhaps build a bridge or a compromise. Encourage groups to produce a visual summary of their discussion, which can be shared or photographed for future reference. Encourage the students with autism to separately record any thoughts contrary to the group. So that reduces anxiety. Some students can feel immense anxiety if they have very different ideas to the rest of the group. Or perhaps allow independent working alongside a group to start with, if preferred, so that they can just observe how the group works without being involved or part of it. Observing how things work or how people interact is a very useful strategy. Consider keeping successful group dynamics, so working in a familiar group can support the learning process, and peer mentoring, having a connected peer, has proven successful in research in Australia. So another personal example. Catherine was withdrawn in seminars and preferred to sit alone. Catherine had a specially trained wellbeing dog which accompanied her to sessions. Caring for the dog's welfare and the novelty of this within the group worked really positively for Catherine, enabling her to make friendships and social links with the group. However, this was not enough on its own, and further support was needed around anxiety linked to assignments and placements. On the days her anxiety prevented her from attending a lecture, she had access to the note-taker service to provide notes that she could work from and to incorporate into her understanding. Catherine required more time and additional tutorials to complete her assignments, despite her understanding of the topic being very strong. She required a supported introductory visit to her placement in order to meet a new key contact and be able to visualize and orientate herself within the new setting. So that was an individualized approach for that particular student around social engagement. Organisation and planning. Students with autism can really benefit from feeling comfortable to access those academic services, however we do it, provided for all students with learning and assignments. However, many students with autism might not realise they need to access this support or how to access it. So by embedding these support services into the taught modules and programmes, students can build familiarity with the learning support staff in a familiar context. And this could potentially help them to feel confident to book further one-to-one sessions from the support services. For some autistic students, one-to-one sessions might be too intense. They might prefer to book with a trusted friend or a peer mentor, or to make an appointment with a staff member who is more aware of their potential challenges, those experienced by autistic students. Others might need clear signposting to video resources or narrated PowerPoints that can guide them through different procedures and that they can access independently. One that I used was steps to writing a report, and we embedded that within the module materials for a particular session, and that was a good point of reference for many students to refer back to. So they can be quite simple strategies, not too far from our current knowledge and experience. So how can autistic students overcome their possible issues with executive functioning to organise information into a successful essay, into a report or a project? So depending on fluency, maybe voice to text or planning software may be helpful. Alternatively, post-it notes with key themes on can be highly visual and enable them to be rearranged into a suitable structure. With some assignment briefs, it can be desirable to provide all students with a suggested structure to help them get started. And this can take the form of prompting questions or a writing frame, just something that helps them to organise their own knowledge into a useful structure. So here we are, Emily again has suggested giving students a note-taking template with questions to help them find the answers throughout the lecture. A lecturer in the first year did this for Emily, and she found it incredibly useful for helping herself engage in the lecture and absorb the information. It also helped her to select the most important information. And for students with executive functioning issues, selecting the most important information is sometimes a real issue. So yes, a suggested structure, prompting questions or a writing frame can be helpful to all students. Be explicit in what is relevant to the assignment and state to the student where they have gone off topic. Topic maintenance can be a challenge to some autistic students. Consider providing additional check-ins or optional tutorials online, just to steer them in the right direction and to reassure. Modelling and demonstrating is most effective, particularly deconstructing a good example and discussing explicitly why it's so successful. But we must also remember some students with autism might require help with their general day-to-day organisation and time management. A calendar, checklists in notes and reminder alerts on their phone help the student to organise their time. A wall planner or post-it notes at various points can support executive function issues. Remember, our most brilliant academic autistic students might struggle with simple sequences in everyday life, unless familiar routine or visually supported in some way. So students with autism might need support to access or set up support. Support to get support. Okay. Sensory processing and enabling environments. Is the learning environment suitable to minimise distraction and sensory overload to enable the best possible focus? Can visual and auditory stimulation be reduced further? Explore it together, have a conversation and see what can be adjusted to reduce the sensory effects of their current seating arrangement. So an example, for example, this time it's Karen. Karen felt unable to enter the library for the first 2 years of her 3-year course. The library induction had been through video and online sessions and face-to-face teaching in the usual classroom. She could not overcome the anxiety she felt at thinking of entering the glass doors and not knowing the layout or systems inside. Then in her 3rd year, she worked in the library for the first time with a small study group, and she quickly realised this enabling environment was perfect for her to learn in, particularly in the evening when it was quiet. So for the first 2 years, she missed out on learning in the environment that was best suited to her due to the anxiety of approaching those glass doors. If we can arrange inductions or small group support where a peer or a trusted tutor can bring the autistic student into the library for that initial introduction, that can be very beneficial. Helen, however, when she went in the library, she felt envious and frustrated that she could not work in the library like other students, as the typing noises or the sound of crisps being eaten were preventing any kind of concentration, because she was unable to filter those noises out from the background. So she found it to be a very stressful situation. So this is why an individualised sensory audit can identify some of these issues. Okay. There we go. So another set of challenges that our autistic students face is rigidity, anxiety, and frustration. So making instructions and learning clear can alleviate some anxiety for autistic students, and working within a visual framework can provide this. This might be clear links to learning outcomes, a schedule for the session, or a series of progressive materials to work through or to attend to. Some students with autism experience immense anxiety about making mistakes. They're aiming for perfection and they feel frustrated when this isn't achieved. So support the student's self-image as a learner by reflecting elements of success, but also by being explicit in the importance of the process of redrafting and encouraging mistakes to be made in the interest of learning from them, such as we have in the growth mindset theory of Dweck. So we can support confidence by asking the student which seat they prefer and allowing them to return to it. We can provide support, peer support for whole university or program events, or to support changes to the usual delivery. Aim to pre-warn of any unexpected changes to the usual session as soon as possible and in a visual format, as such as an email or an announcement. Give students with autism consent to leave a lecture if they begin to feel frustrated, to take time to regulate and then re-enter when they feel able to. Provide quiet spaces that are known to the student where they can de-stress. And perhaps discuss with the individual student the best way to use breaks for them personally, because everybody is different. Transitions are something that can be quite challenging. So we try to support transitions by explaining what's coming, supporting the transition itself, and then reassuring and checking in with the student after the transition. Perhaps allowing the autistic student to enter early or last in order to avoid busy times is a useful strategy. Consider accompanying autistic students into the library or the canteen for the first time so they can be confident in using the system correctly, and rehearse this during a quiet spell. Okay. Seventh area of the 10 areas for consideration and conversation is the task content, presentation, and assessment. Is the task content meaningful and purposeful in the student's opinion? For many students on the autistic spectrum, activities they engage in will need to be meaningful and for a useful purpose. Being explicit about the relevance or importance of a subtopic can help with motivation and encourage effort. The way in which the virtual learning environment is set up can be instrumental to this, especially if it allows materials to be previewed in advance of the session. Having a personal interest in the topic can be motivating, and so can knowing a quantifiable amount or a clear endpoint to demonstrate completion. So if they know how much is expected or how long or what the endpoint of the learning session is, that can help it to feel manageable. So for an example, Emily again recommends other forms of extra reading. So perhaps using YouTube videos or a documentary that would be beneficial for students that struggle with processing single mode information. She finds this useful when she wants to watch something being applied, because she finds that's her best way to understand. She needs to see it in action, she says. Now, Rachel's vignette, her assignment involved arranging and conducting a professional conversation with a SEND practitioner. She found that initial approach almost impossible to make. She didn't know how to word her email or her conversation. She didn't know where to start in that initial connection with a SEND practitioner. However, after a supported introduction, she was able to conduct her professional conversation to a very good standard and gleaned enough content for her assignment to be completed. But that initial email connection was a massive obstacle, a barrier to her learning continuing. Now, Owen found written assignments really difficult to engage with. He was given the option of a mixed media presentation in the hope his thorough understanding and verbal expressive ability would be captured. So there's some flexibility in just getting over those initial hurdles to support students to then continue to demonstrate their learning and their knowledge and their ability. Okay, we're nearly there. Motivation is the 8th area that came out through my research, and students need to feel interested. We know this in order to be motivated and to feel a sense of reward for their efforts. And you know, different factors might motivate our autistic students, but the theory is the same. Familiar teaching methods and structures are less threatening and more certain, and so that fuels the motivation further. Decky and Ryan, their self-determination theory demonstrates the 3 basic human needs to feel motivated. That is competence, being effective in dealing with the environment. There needs to be autonomy, needing control of the course of their lives, and relatedness, needing to have a close relationship with others. If we don't lose sight of the theory that we already know, but we just identify the factors that are unique to the individual, then we can continue to support motivation using our existing understanding. Characteristics of comorbidity. I said at the very beginning of this presentation that it's really important when we converse and collaborate with our autistic students that we become aware of any other conditions or traits which might become a barrier to their future learning. And this also includes any health or mental health issues such as depression. And if we look at the slide here, we can ask ourselves, does the student display any dyslexic traits? Would they benefit from any specific learning difficulties strategies or visual and auditory supports? Are there any visual discrimination difficulties? Does hypermobility, which often coexists with autism, create health issues including joint and muscle pain, dislocation, or chronic fatigue? Is epilepsy controlled by effective medication? Is there a response plan in place? Are issues with focus, impulsivity, and hyperactivity of ADHD impacting further on access to learning? And what barriers to learning are co-occurring conditions creating? So we need to look outside the diagnosis to a holistic, bigger picture of the challenges and strengths of the student. Okay. So the final of the 10 considerations is around motor control, mental health, or fatigue. So in addition to cognitive energy expenditure in academic and social learning, elements of autism such as motor control, mental health, and fatigue can create further challenges for the autistic student. Technology can assist in alleviating the burden of motor control in the case of handwriting lecture notes or dictaphones or recording, but it is important to recognise the pervasive effects of mental health challenges and fatigue. Our young female autistic students are particularly prone to exhaustion due to masking their autistic traits, especially whilst out and about. And this masking can be very difficult to sustain. And this can result in suppression of feelings and eventually, like the stress bucket that we considered at the beginning, an overflowing of emotion when in a safe environment, such as returning home or to their accommodation. We also need to employ our understanding of safeguarding in higher education to keep our autistic students safe, being alert to any changes in their behaviours or well-being, which might give us underlying concerns regarding mental health issues. And the best way of identifying these is if we have formed that genuine relationship right at the beginning and we are having regular conversations and check-ins in a very natural social way with our students, creating that sense of belonging. Cognitive behaviour therapy, or CBT, can help some students to reframe their thoughts, feelings, and actions to improve their outlooks and interactions. However, we must remember this is a talking therapy and may not be appropriate for many of our autistic students. Offering a more comfortable university experience with some small changes in practice and approach can make a big difference. So in summary, the university experience is made up of positive and negative factors and threads which we need to understand both at a general and an individual level through collaboration. Autism affects communication, social interaction, and the processing of information, both cognitive and sensory. And this drives responses and behaviours which are often routine or repetitive. That's our diagnostic criteria. These differences make everyday experiences unpredictable, often creating anxiety and a strong preference for familiarity and sameness. The challenges and barriers created by autism can be diminished by building upon individual strengths and offering the right support for that individual. But more generally, we've got some principles. We can make assumed or implicit learning explicit. We can make auditory information, which is invisible and fleeting, visual. We can back it up with visual support. We can try and make the uncertain situation, as far as possible, more predictable by providing overviews or previews. We can reduce sensory stimulation, again, where possible, in order to help the student focus, concentrate, remember, and learn. We can reduce anxiety by implementing these strategies. but above all, form a genuine relationship with the student to discover the most beneficial autism practice for them. Some references. So, Julia, do we have any questions in our chat function? That concludes my presentation.
We do. I've been picking some of them up and answering them directly, and then I've been
Brilliant.
putting
Thank you.
some in the collective chat. I think the last one, really, beyond those which are system changes, was from Diana, who wanted to explore what it might mean in terms of strategies for neurodivergent students. And did we feel that some of the strategies might be applicable to them, and how can we support those types of learners?
Definitely. I think we need to recall that there's great overlap of our neurodiverse students, and that a lot of those issues with things like memory, processing, executive function, you know, so that organising and sequencing would all be very much a feature of those neurodiverse students' learning style. So a lot of the strategies that we've discussed today, which have come under the heading of autism, are actually equally applicable for students that have those sort of either expressive language, receptive language, visual memory, auditory memory issues, which are part of things like ADHD, dyslexia,